Well, as I explained in the email, here's an overview of the lectures, seminars, book reviews, which I've been doing over the last 10 years in London, Dallas, and Los Angeles for all sorts of clubs, retirement centers, and all sorts of organizations, actually. So the first category I just want to give you an overview from, and you can choose from any of these, and there are always others in progress, is the first category is Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill. And this has proved very popular. I do a presentation on his early life, family circumstances, school days, early military career, a journalist, and his entry into politics for the first time. It's not a very long and famous career as a politician, as a statesman, as a leader. So that's one. And then the second one is obviously very connected. Lady Randolph Churchill, his mother, who was American and a socialite. She was a volunteer. From socialite, she progressed in later years, as often happens, into voluntary work. She was a volunteer war nurse. And then Sir Winston's wife, Clementine Churchill. Now, most people know about Clementine Churchill from the films that have been made and what they have read. Very popular films, a recent one that has been made. But they don't know some of the detail that I will present about her, and they may be surprised by it as well, because she's been caricatured in a certain way, and that's part of her character, but we'll go more fully into that. So this is something I have done presentations extensively in the United States, but also at Churchill College in London, Richland College in Dallas. I did an 8-part presentation there on Winston Churchill and his wife. And I actually, for Churchill Retirement Homes, which is the biggest retirement home builder in Britain, they sent me from London to Liverpool and everywhere in between, lecturing to baby boomers about Churchill. And that was a great experience, because met a lot of people that had known him, and one of the thrills of all these lectures is the Q&A afterwards, which I always devote a lot of time to. Now, as regards Clementine Churchill, little known facts about her and her daughters and their only son will be revealed, but also her contributions to the war effort, and she was a force to be contended there, and these are things that really people don't know about her, which were great contributions to World War I and to World War II, besides the general support and encouragement and toleration of Winston. Then there's another one on the wit of Winston Churchill. That's a whole presentation on itself. That's a fun one. Then something which intrigues me, because in many ways their lives were similar. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, their intertwined lives, particularly in the Second World War, but their lives were very similar from the beginning. They went to Anglican schools, and they had this sense of duty towards their countries, and of course that was a very, very crucial, important relationship of high importance, not only to the United States and Britain, but also to the whole world in the 20th century. And then I came across a book about a year ago called Citizens of London, which is a fascinating account of Britain in the Blitz, but also Americans in the Blitz, particularly some very high-profile Americans, such as John Winant, the ambassador to England who superseded Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, Harry Hopkins, who was the personal envoy of Franklin Roosevelt to Britain on a fact-finding tour for Roosevelt to see what was going on and whether the British would sustain their opposition to Hitler. Edward R. Murrow, the very distinguished reporter who broadcast live from the Blitz about the Blitz and the bravery of the British people from back to the United States, which made a big impression here at the time. Now, all of these people, I've actually missed out one, very famous name, Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman was sent by Roosevelt to negotiate and to effectively oil the Lend-Lease program, whereby Britain were sent arms before America entered the war. Now, all these four Americans were kind of adopted by the Churchill family, and that is an interesting in itself, their interconnection, not only with Clementine and Winston, but also with their daughters, and there's a tale to be told there as well. Recently has come available on will be coming online in KRA soon, another interesting story about Franklin Roosevelt, and it's called The Atlantic Crossing. And this deals with a Norwegian princess who ended up in the White House after the Germans had entered Holland, obviously escaping from them. And this had parallels with other members of the European royal family which ended up in London. That's, I think, an 8-part series and looks very interesting. And I will do a presentation on that for sure. Other presentations for Churchill, a few years ago, quite a few years ago, about 30 years ago, I came across a book by Winston Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran. He was his doctor, assigned to him, personal doctor, to accompany him all the way through World War II, and then be his doctor after World War II. So he was his doctor from 1940 to 1965, and there are some fascinating details about Churchill's health and the way he progressed through World War II, where he got that great stamina from, even though he was an ill man during World War II and then became progressively not so well, yet he had a really robust constitution and lived till 90, to the amazement of his doctor, I think, and many other people who knew how much he smoked those inimitable cigars and drank those famous brandy and champagne in large quantities. And then 2 locations in Britain, Blenheim Palace, where Churchill was born. Don't forget, he was born an aristocrat, but he had to make his own way in life because he was the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. So many of you maybe have visited that already, but if you haven't, that's a fascinating place to learn more about. So Blenheim Palace, and of course the great family of Churchills that preceded Winston. He had a great heritage of soldier generals and politicians and very powerful women in his family as well. And then Chartwell, the country house in Kent, which he bought before World War II and was his sanctuary during the 30s when he was in the wilderness, and some of you may have visited there also. A very special house for Winston, which he kept up until almost up until his death in 1965. Clementine Churchill hated the house, and we go more into that at a later date. There are very good reasons for that. And the last Churchill one is called Churchill and Boris Johnson. Now, it's a book called that's my life laughing in the background there at me. Churchill and Boris Johnson, The Churchill Factor by Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is a very good writer, probably a better writer than a politician, sort of in the Disraeli mode, although he's very different to Disraeli in other ways. This, if you're going to read one book about Churchill, you should read this, The Churchill Factor. Some brilliant chapters on different times of his life. And I think the enthusiasm that Boris Johnson, the English Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, has for Churchill is very broad in England, because don't forget, Churchill really dominated the history of the 20th century, for British people anyway, along with Nelson and Wellington and Victoria from different eras. And so if you want to get a feel of the depth of how much respect British people have for Winston Churchill, not all of them, but the majority of them, then that's one book you should read. Now, the next category of presentations are on British royalty, English royalty, British royalty. And I was trained as a teacher of history and then became a lecturer of history. And so my areas of interest were British history, American history, and of course they're so intertwined with world history. And one of the subjects I did a lot of work on was Elizabeth Tudor, the first, the daughter of Henry VIII, known as Gloriana, a fascinating reign that she had, very much connected to the Anglican Church, of course, but also English expansionism at the end of the 16th century, a formidable woman. And coming out soon on, or actually is out already on Stars, but you can also pay for it on Netflix. But one of those two, you can see it, is a very good series on one of the central women characters of the 16th century. And we're talking, the title of it is The Spanish Princess, and it talks about Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. And of course, intertwined with her story is the story of the divorce and the split of the Anglican Church from Rome, but also the Reformation. And so you have all the characters in there so well known from British history. So you have all the Thomases, you have Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, all of the Thomases are there. And so it's a very good person to study of that time. You get a flavor of the Reformation time and the great upheavals that were going on there, and you also learn a lot about the character of Henry VIII. Now, in the last 3 or 4 years, I presented on Queen Victoria and on her life. I presented at Richland College and did another 8-part series on that. Not only her, but the Victorian age generally. And of course, this the interest in her has been sparked again by the KRA series Victoria. And this is a very popular series, and it's due to return sometime in 2021. Pandemics and that scheduling has kind of delayed it a little bit, but it will be coming back. It's a fascinating history, the relationship with Prince Albert, and also Prince Albert's relationship with the United States and the southern states at the time of the American Civil War, just before he died. That very much comes into it as well, and I talk about that. And then, of course, Elizabeth II has reigned, our longest reigning monarch now for 67 years. And has recently, in this most horrible year that's gone by, in 2 broadcasts, one in June and one in December, excelled even her standards of speeches, which she doesn't write many speeches herself, but these she does write herself, to try and bolster the morale of the British people. And she was successful in doing that on Christmas Day. I commend that one to you, but also in June. And so to have a figurehead that well respected and that well trusted, disregard the rest of the royal family now out of that, but the British people are very loyal, as are the people across the Commonwealth, so which is a thing dear to the Queen's heart. So you imagine when she speaks on Christmas Day, she's speaking to 1/3 of the world at that time. And so we will look at that, and the also the series The Crown. I have done the historical background and history and cultural history to the first 4 series of The Crown, and as people watch it in the United States, and it's always interesting, people in the United States many people are fascinated with the royal family, just as in Britain many people are fascinated by presidents over here. But this has gone down very well. And in the future, I will be doing the next 2 series as well, which will be the last of the series. 2 years ago, I happened to be invited by a member of the royal household as a historian, I was invited to go and study at Windsor Castle about the time of the royal wedding, just after actually, study Windsor Castle and St George's Chapel. And I eagerly took that opportunity, and it was enlightening, very enlightening, and I got the opportunity to talk to some members of the royal household. And so this made me prepare the presentation from Wallis Simpson to Meghan Markle, from the Duchess of Windsor to the Duchess of Sussex, you know, that proved very popular, and now I am offering this year a follow-on to that at a respectable distance, because I don't really deal in gossip. I don't like gossip. But I thought perhaps the time has passed where we kind of consider what happened from this kind of glorious, exciting chapter that happened 2 years ago to a very different situation now. And the title of the presentation is "Where Did It All Go Wrong?" That would be really from the British perspective, but some Americans share that, not all of them, I appreciate that. As regards Meghan Markle and Harry, and maybe a lot of Americans, where did it all go right for them? You know, the beauty of being a dual national, which I am, you know, an American citizen and a British citizen, is that I can see it from both sides. And so that's what I tried to do, to be fair to the couple and look at all the reasons that this happened as far as we know. Of course, a lot of it we will probably never know. Also, I present either in lectures or seminars or both, which is the same for most of these things I do, Prince Charles, including Diana, and the title is A Once and Future King. Prince Charles has had the longest apprenticeship of any Prince of Wales in history, and that has prepared him to be king as long as he survives his mother, which is obviously an unknown. And so we look at his life, a very long life, controversial in many respects, but it is interesting now that the Queen has devolved many of the duties to him, which she used to do, not all of them, which is interesting, but many of them. We will look at him as a father, as a prince, as a kind of social activist as well for many causes such as conservation, food purity, and global warming. So he is a very interesting character. Also in relation to Prince Charles, but also the Queen and the whole royal family, Prince Charles had, it was actually his great uncle, he called him uncle. He was closest to him, he was almost like a father to him. So we will look at the life and times of Lord Louis Mountbatten, right up to and spending some time on his assassination in the late 70s by the IRA when he was out fishing in Ireland with many of his family. And we will include that in there, a book by one of the survivors of that bomb, which killed several people, including Lord Mountbatten, and maimed other people as well, but someone who survived that after hospitalization, a close family member. And the book is all about forgiveness, which is a very interesting concept, considering, you know, you have just been blown up and lost many of your loved ones. And in June, Prince Philip will be 100. And so, as a tribute, and this is what I've already done extensively, it went down very well. He's an interesting character as well. Many sides to his character, some of them unknown, which I will reveal, and probably some you've probably never heard of as well. So that's Prince Philip at 100. And then lastly, the Queen's mother, who's known as Elizabeth also, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who lived through all the abdication crisis. There is her cousin, who was her lady in waiting for a long time, read a very interesting book called The Final Curtsy, and reveals many things about her character, her Scottishness, obviously, her long widowhood, her times with the Queen's father during the war, Another very interesting person. And then, as Monty Python used to say, now for something completely different. I became interested in the friendship of Dame Judi Dench and Dame Maggie Smith a few years ago. So I put together a presentation called There Is Nothing Like a Dame. Two great friends, which they are, two great actors, which undoubtedly they are, Oscar-winning actors, but two very different people. And I concentrate on their childhoods in particular and how their early careers went. So that's also been presented at Richland College in Dallas and in London, back in London, and also in California. Now, talking of travel and different destinations, the next one is called a travel and travelogue section. Last year, when KARA were advertising their tour to England to kind of enrich people's experiences of things seen on KARA, I decided to put mine together for people here who, for health reasons, or didn't want to spend $8,000 for a couple to go to England to get a tour and to see these sites, which I know all of them intimately. I tried to put together myself images and be the tour guide for those people, and it wouldn't cost them anything. And so that's what I've done. And so I'm preparing for September another one of those, because KARA are doing it again. They've got slightly different places to go, all very interesting, which they'll tell you about over this year. And I will be your tour guide. I will be your tour guide for that. Another presentation which stands alone out of that, if somebody really likes travelogues, and a very humorous book, one of the funniest books I've ever read in my life, because as an American, he sees the British character so well. There's a book by Bill Bryson called Notes from a Small Island. And I look forward to presenting some of the information in the many different locations he travels within England and his observations on the British character. Next one is Margaret Thatcher. I will do a life of hers. I will also talk within that life about her many connections to Dallas, which some of you already know. And I will also do a separate presentation because she and Ronald Reagan bestrode like colossi the 1980s. So how they agreed politically and philosophically in that very interesting 80s time. Now here we have a kind of smorgasbord of other eclectic presentations. I'm from Bristol, and my family had some connections to Cary Grant's mother in Bristol. I grew up hearing a lot about Cary Grant because Bristol's very proud of him in the West Country in England. They even got a statue of him there right in the centre. And the presentation is called Cary Grant from Bristol, England to Hollywood. And you will learn in there many things about his early childhood and how he got into acting and how he ended up in the United States that perhaps you've never heard at all before. And I think that's what makes it interesting for people, because many people know his movies, but we will discuss his movies also in the Q&A and why you felt, you know, and he's kind of still with us, isn't he, on the television every day, you know, different channels you flick through, there's a Cary Grant movie. And then an appreciation of the life of Alistair Cook. For many years he sent a radio program to England called Letter from America, which I grew up with, which explained the American country and system to British people, so he did a really good job there. And then he did the job in reverse when he hosted Masterpiece Theatre for so many years. He was the interpreter of all things British, costume dramas, histories, great writers, to American people on Sunday evenings. So many people have very fond memories of him, and a very interesting life he has from the early days when he was very friendly with Charlie Chaplin out in Hollywood, right to broadcasting right to the end of his life in 2004. Now, KRA Public Television are featuring on January the 10th a new interpretation of the All Creatures Great and Small, a remake of it. Many of you have seen the first one with Robert Hardy, But this one I've seen back in England because it was broadcast there when I was back in England recently. It's an 8-part series and it is very, very good. It's just as good as the original, if not perhaps in some ways a little bit better. I found it very, very good, very relaxing for the pandemic. Many of these nostalgia things we do during this time of pandemic are really good for our morale, and so I commend that to you. But I will be doing a presentation about James Herriot, whose life is the inspiration for these books he wrote on being a vet in Yorkshire. We'll talk about Yorkshire people, we'll talk about the series and the characters in the series. So that's All Creatures Great and Small. And then the life of Greer Garson, who many of you know spent a long time resident of Highland Park, who initially trained as a teacher in London, an English teacher, then went on the stage very briefly and was snapped up by Hollywood, then had a brief but startling career, Oscar-winning career, Mrs. Miniver and Goodbye Mr. Chips, before she retired to Highland Park and went into philanthropy. Her husband was an oil executive and he snapped her up on a visit to a theatre in London. So Greer Garson, that's another one. And then for Christmas time, the Mitford series, and we'll look at a Mitford Christmas. Many of you are probably familiar with the Mitford books. Talks about a small town, and they were very popular in the 90s. 10 to 12 books written by Jan Karan. A Life of Jane Austen, which is always interesting when you see how well she writes, and many of her writings reflect her life. A presentation on Sir David Frost, who famously interviewed Nixon after his resignation about Watergate. He was the premier interviewer in the 80s and the 90s, spent a lot of time in the USA doing USA TV and interviews, a lot of time back in Britain. He had like a season ticket for Concorde. He was going to and fro. He was really commuting from England on Concorde to the United States. We look at his life, very interesting early life, how he got into that sort of thing. Interviewed so many prime ministers, so many famous people, including the Shah of Iran, but there's a huge list of people he interviewed. And then, now, whenever we can get back to singing again, I would like to do something which, when I was a chaplain at Elder Hostel in Connecticut, I took part in a 3-day course with some Gilbert and Sullivan fans. And I'd always liked Gilbert and Sullivan. I grew up with it in school, many probably did, because Gilbert and Sullivan stretched in its popularity from the 19th century right the way up to the 1960s, even now there are fans. And the songs are great fun. And so we'll look at the life of Gilbert and look at the life of Sullivan and the phenomenon that was of light opera that was Gilbert and Sullivan. The only other phenomenon to come anywhere near it and compare it in a late 20th century, 21st century way would be Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. And then we will look at Highclere Castle, which was the location and the real story about Downton Abbey, how it was based on Highclere Castle, and talk a little bit about the Downton Abbey series as well in a presentation. Mystery and detective weekends or presentations. So one of them will be on Oxford. Oxford, England was particularly Oxford University played a big part in all this. Oxford University in Oxford, England. So many murders there, weren't there? I wish sure there are not so many murders as appear on television, but for the sake of the creators of Morse, Lewis, Endeavour, we will do a short history of the city itself, because the city has a long history as well, but also talk about those famous crime books which were televised and became so popular. Grantchester, story of a vicar and a detective who are in partnership. Shakespeare and Hathaway, based in Stratford-on-Avon, and a series called Pie in the Sky with the very fine actor who has a restaurant, but he's a retired police officer as well, and they won't let him retire, Richard Griffiths. There is a new detective series coming out, which I think will prove popular on Netflix, called the Miss Scarlet and the Duke, and it's set in Victorian times. Now, we've all enjoyed Sherlock Holmes, but I think detective stories located in the 19th century, there's a certain kind of cachet to them, if you like. I find them very interesting. So that's something that I will be working on this year. Other things I have in the pipeline, talking about working this year, Bridgerton is coming out. It's a series about Regency London. And then, because I am from Wessex and that part of the world, which is the West Country, very Celtic part of the world, there's a series which is already out on the Last Kingdom, Alfred the Great, how King Alfred rolled back the Vikings who had invaded and united England into something as we know it now. So there we have it. Those are the topics, materials for, actually there's enough there for 2 years, and some I haven't even talked about, are presentations, short courses, longer courses, seminars which can come out of them. Whichever way it leads you, you have to decide what you think would be best for your particular location. And you know what? We haven't even touched upon another favourite of mine, British comedy.